Well, I have a wonderful electronic invention I want you to see.
It looks something like this.
Welcome to my guide on high-end grinding. Up on screen are some of the topics that I'm planning on covering in this video. I apologize in advance that this video is going to probably end up being very long. I will create shortcuts and description for this video, or you can click ahead to each individual section and grab tidbits if you're going to go rewatch, or if you only want to look at one section of this video. This guide is going to be tailored towards those coming up, graduating out of some of the lower end Valencia spots, thinking about starting to go into higher end spots in the game, either freshly, had never been there before, or you've already played around with maybe Mansions or somewhere else and aren't getting the results that you were hoping for, or aren't getting the results that you hear about from other people, either on Reddit or forums or in a guild or whatever. So let's just jump straight in. So what is high-end grinding, and more importantly, when are you ready for high-end grinding? For me, high-end grinding is characterized by a couple of different things. The main thing that I think is commonly perceived as high-end grinding is 240 AP plus spots. And while I think that is obviously true, there are other spots that I would personally categorize as high-end grinding. I think high-end grinding comes down to having to pull or group mobs for maximum efficiency. So spots like Gahaz, where you're plowing through mobs as quickly as possible, is a completely different strategy from say Akhman, where you want to group the mobs and then kill them as quickly as possible, and it's less about actually moving. The density in some of these spots is much higher. Pulling or grouping is very important because the mobs do not die in one hit. The other thing is that these mobs will generally also have CCs. So if you look at Manchums, Akhman, Histria, Ronaros, I would also include Kadri, Pila, and then you obviously have your group spots, but I'm going to focus mostly on solo spots. So Ronaros, the Lancers will stun you, versus a spot like Nagas, you're generally not ever going to get CC'd by the mobs, even if they do have CCs. So having to group and pull, having to avoid CCs or CC the mobs to keep them from CCing you or killing you because of their damage output, and then also just CCing the mobs to maximize your own damage output. So going back more generically to what is categorized and thought of as high-end grinding, Ronaros, Manchums, Akhman, Histria, and then the soon-to-be Sakraya Ruins and Stargrave. Obviously, all these spots have different gear requirements, but if you're looking at jumping into probably Akhman or Manchums starting out, what is gear ready for these spots? What does that look like? And you're going to get different opinions from everybody, so I'm going to avoid talking about specific AP requirements for each spot, because through gem, skill add-on optimization, buffing, what is going to be your entry point is going to vary, and also class to class. So I'm going to avoid talking about those things, and I'm going to focus on two things. What is the DP requirement for you to not be killed at these spots, and also at what rate can you kill the mobs that these spots are going to be worthwhile. So for most of these spots, the mobs are going to have CC mechanics, and these CC mechanics will get you killed. Akhman, for example, the elites will do a spinny hammer attack. They'll knock you on the ground, and then you will get attacked by a whole group of mobs, and if you are under soft cap DP, there's a good chance that you are going to die. So you really want to have tight boss gear at minimum, with Uragons. You can go into these spots with evasion gear as well, but you need to have much more dedicated evasion gear if you do not have a normal standard Griffin / Giath, Uragons, Dimtree, and Bex. If you're going to run evasion gear, you have to have the full set of everything. I do not recommend going in there with Griffins, Dimtree, Begs, and Muskins. You will take much more damage than you need to take. You can go Muskins, Liebers, Heave Helm, Dimtree, or something similar, and probably still be fine. You really have to have PvP levels of evasion for it to work. So as far as damage requirements to be able to do these spots and do them effectively, you really want ideally to be able to kill the mobs in one full DPS cycle. What that's going to look like per class is going to be a little bit different, and if a DPS cycle makes no sense to you, what I'm talking about will make a little bit more sense later on in the video. Is a pretty common thing for people that are experienced grinders, whether or not they would actually call it that. At harder spots like Histria, and then probably Sakraya and Stargrave coming soon, possibly 2 full cycles might be required. I think if it takes more than 2 cycles, the spot's just not going to be worth for anybody at that point. But if you're in between 1 and 2, it's probably worth being there. It's just not going to feel really comfy of a grind until you get some more practice in and maybe some more gear to bring that down to just essentially one combo in a pack of mobs. Okay, so on to pulling and grouping. If you've been around the Twitch community or you've looked at some YouTube videos, you probably know what I'm talking about. If you don't, hopefully you'll know what I'm talking about and why it's really, really important at all of these spots to know how to group and pull correctly. So to break this down into 2 parts, pulling is less of a factor at some spots versus others. In particular, Mansham's has very little pulling involved. Some classes may benefit from pulling and stacking groups, but in general, it's broken down strictly into active grouping. And active grouping is important at every spot, but it's very important at these higher end spots that require more time and effort to kill the mobs where you're not killing them in one hit. So what grouping essentially is while you're attacking the mobs, you're actively trying to keep the mobs together while you're DPSing them down. And this is really important because if you set up this great pull, right? Say you're grinding Akhman, you set up this great pull, you get them all stacked on top of each other, and then you go into DPS and you start casting knockbacks, knockdowns, and the mobs just spread out all over the place. And this kills your DPS efficiency. So actively stacking the mobs back on top of each other as you're killing them is a very important technique to learn. So I'm going to start off with a couple of demonstrations on what bad grouping looks like. So as you can see, I come down this hallway, I pull the mobs, I wait for them to come to me. And as soon as they start to group up, I cast a knockback, knockdown combo skill. You see they just spread out. So here's another clip. It's just a run roast pull, right? It's 3 packs. You can see I don't wait for the mobs to group up. And I start DPSing too early. And as soon as I start killing mobs, they're still spread out. And the problem just goes from bad to worse as I have to focus down mobs individually or in smaller groups versus taking all of these out in one straight combo. This pack right here, I cast my knockback in the middle of the group instead of on the edge, and spend way too much time cleaning up all of the stray mobs that didn't get grouped properly. So what does good, or at least passable, grouping look like? So right here, I pulled this pack, buff up, debuff, and then the mobs are still pretty spread out. So I go for a knockback skill, and I then move behind them and start casting knockdown abilities to push them back into each other to try to tighten them up a little bit so that my skills are hitting most, if not all, of the mobs. Effectively cutting the time to kill for that pack way down. So So here's that same group at Mansions on a different loop. You can see I knock back this time, but I clump all of the mobs together instead of hitting them right in the middle, and have very little cleanup to do afterwards. So here's a history pull by contrast. I get the pull going, get the mobs grouped up, and then I do a much better job on this one keeping them grouped up by moving around them as I'm casting different CC skills. And I get most of my skills to land on almost all the mobs, save the one Elton, and when I finish up, all that's left is a little bit of cleanup on that second Elton, and that's due more to a suboptimal pull than grouping. Okay, so there's two fairly important things to understand about pulling. One is that when you attack a mob, the mob will run to the point in which you attacked it. As you can see from the clip that's showing right now, that Elton ran directly and attacked the spot from where I shot him from. This is really important, especially at spots like Histria or Gyphon, where the mobs move much slower. You need to be very deliberate about where you want the mob to end up at, and avoid attacking the mobs too early. The other thing is you want to pull in one continuous direction, so that the mobs that you pull early will pull onto the mobs that you pull next. This way they'll ideally all clump up roughly about the same amount of time. So here's that same pull on a different loop, and you can see I tagged this Elton a little too far over to the left this time, and if you watch him, he runs over to the spot in which that could have dramatically slowed down that pull. The other tool with pulling that can be really valuable is don't be afraid to, if you have stragglers, to pull onto the next pack, especially at spots like Roneros, Mansions, or Offman, where the mobs move much quicker than, say, Histria. If you have 3 or 4 stragglers that are all about half HP, it's pretty inefficient to sit there and try to kill those mobs. It's much better to take those mobs, pull them on another pack, and be at the 10 mob aggro limit as much as possible, just to maximize your DPS. And taking the time to pull into the next pack also gives a chance for your cooldowns to refresh, so you can hit the mobs harder. On to mob behavior and why does it even matter in the first place. So I've touched on some points already about how mobs work, how they attack you, how they move. So let's start with CCs. Why are CCs important? It seems like probably a pretty stupid question, but CCs are really important for 2 reasons. One, if the mob is CC'd is not attacking you, and as we discussed previously, these mobs can do a lot of damage. You go into history at night with just barely soft cap DP or lower, you can take 3/4 of your HP in a matter of a half a second. So keeping the mob CC'd is extremely important for that fact. The second reason, obviously, is to benefit from attack modifiers. We'll cover how to utilize attack modifiers a little bit later, but CCing mobs to benefit from attack modifiers, the obvious one being down attack to just increase your damage output. And obviously more damage means you're killing faster, and killing faster means more money, which is the whole point of grinding in the first place. So CCing is really important. And understanding what CCs work on what mobs and how they work. So as a rule, Mansions and Akban, the mobs are susceptible to any CCs, save the Great Warriors at Mansions being immune to any CC. Akban mobs have higher resistances, so having ignore resist is beneficial for reliably landing CCs on them. And then Histria mobs are a little bit special. They're only susceptible to stiffens, stuns, and knockdowns, and some knockbacks. All 3 CCs function the same way. They stun the mobs instead of actually knocking them down. So on the flip side of that, mobs can also CC you. Knowing what CCs the mobs do is important as well. So Mansions, the Great Warriors, and the Priests both have skills that'll knock down The Mansion Warriors have a leap skill. It triggers 2 instances of damage once as soon as they land, and then an additional hit about a half a second later. Both of these skills will knock down, and the other 2 taller Mansions also have a stab skill that will CC as well. Akhman, both of the elites have knockdown skills, and then you also have the traps that will CC you as well. So stun. In Histria, the Eltons and Boltons both have CC skills that are cast from range when you're not close enough to them. So learning these skills is pretty important because just not only your survivability, especially at nighttime on the lower end of the DP side, but also increasing your damage. If you can either not trigger these skills or not be CC'd, you're going to do more damage because obviously when you're CC'd, you're not attacking. So moving away from talking about pulling and grouping and kind of the fundamental basics of setting up a pack and keeping the pack pinned down while you're killing it, is buffing and debuffing, both before you even show up to the grind spot in long-term buffs. This could be gems, this could be add-ons, this could be running villa buffs and draughts and things like that. But also mid-fight buffs, crit buffs, attack speed buffs, DP downs, evasion downs. These things are a pretty substantial increase to what you're capable of doing damage-wise. So I'm going to pop up my add-ons that I'm currently running at this very moment on screen, and you can see that there's a couple of main things that I'm taking here, and that's PvE attack, monster attack, attack speed, and crit. And why am I taking these things? Why are they important? Right. Number 1, PvE attack. You can choose not to run PvE attack. That's on you. I personally think that if you're going to be doing any high-end grinding, you need to have at least one add-on. It is free AP, and if you can get it on a skill that you can keep near 100% uptime, it's literally just free AP. I mean, and we all know how nice having more AP is. And this is something that's not gear dependent, that you can just pop on whenever you're farming. It's a big deal. It adds a lot. I mean, it's hundreds of trash per hour at every grind spot you can go to. You can get by with having just one. I'd probably recommend 1 awakening, 1 pre-awakening, especially as you move into the higher spectrum, higher APs. You're going to utilize more pre-awakening. The buff lasts a pretty decent amount of time, but having good uptime is pretty valuable. So that's up to you to determine what's worthwhile for you to take and what's not. Secondly, attack speed. This is going to vary on how important this is from class to class, but I mean, attack speed is just more attacks in the same amount of time, and that's just more damage. Attack speed is pretty valuable, especially if you can get on a skill that is at the start of your combo and in the middle of your combo, so you can maintain that attack speed throughout. The third one is crit, and crit becomes much more important when you're not one-shotting mobs. You're taking better advantage of it. A lot of skills, a lot of really damaging, important skills do not actually have crit on them. For example, Ranger Will of the Wind. Very high damage skill, spammable, pretty decent size AoE, has no crit on it. And by running 5 crit on your character sheet, which is 20%, Ranger have a pre-buff or a buff that I can cast at the start of a pack that gives me a 20% crit buff. And then on top of that, I have a 20% crit add-on. And with those things stacked up, I have 60% crit. And alternately, I can run my E-buff instead, which is a 30% buff for longer that overrides the 20% other buff. So I could have 60 or 70% crit on a 0% crit skill. And generally speaking, those skills do a lot of damage by themselves. And when you put that much crit on those skills, the DPS that those skills can put out is pretty incredible. Alternately, there's a lot of skills that maybe have 50% crit on them, and similar, like I could have 100% crit on those skills as well, and on top of the skills that I already have that are 100% crit, and that's just free damage that just stacks up and is more and more valuable the higher the HP pool of the mob is, the tankier the HP of the pool of the mob is. So in addition to add-ons, you have regular buffs. And we all run food and Alkstone at every grind spot. That's a pretty normal thing to do. And villas now are pretty standard, especially if you're a History or Offman. What is maybe a little bit less standard, especially for people coming out of Gahaz, is using draughts or elixir rotations. The common perception is running draughts or elixir rotations is not worth it, or not worth the effort, or not worth the time. And generally speaking, if you're clearing properly in the first place, that the draught or elixir rotation will probably pay for itself in trash loot, if not make you money on top of it. In addition to that, now we have the priest buffs. They're a little bit hard to grab if you're at History and Offman, but if you're going anywhere else, they're pretty easy to snag up as more AP and accuracy. So after that, you have your crystal setup, and your crystal setup, most people like to run a PvP setup. Understandably, crystals are really expensive. They're hard to swap out. But if you are looking at doing one of these spots, or if you're a very serious PvPer, or if you're really struggling in a spot, some crystal changes can go a long way. I'm going to use this next clip to showcase a buff debuff cycle and segue into attack modifiers and comboing right here. So if you watch, I lead with Cold Blade, immediately go into Wailing Wind, go into Nature's Tremble, into Regen, and on screen I'm going to show all of the buffs in play. As you can see, they add up to a pretty substantial difference. With all these buffs and debuffs applied, I then go into what I've been calling a DPS window, and essentially all I mean by that is you've stacked all these buffs up, these debuffs up, then you use high damage skills that benefit from all of these buffs. So with that portion out of the way, we're going to segue into comboing and attack modifiers. And what I mean by comboing is both utilizing these buffs and these debuffs, using these high damage skills, but also with Histria is chaining CCs together, or with Augment and Manshims, doing what I guess I would call a mini combo of chaining a couple of different skills together to utilize an attack modifier. Using attack modifiers and maximizing attack modifiers is really important, obviously because it increases your damage, but knowing what skills to chain together that allow you to use those attack modifiers takes some practice and some knowledge, especially when we talk about PvE CCs and what skills benefit from, say, air attack. Air attack being the most powerful skill modifier in PvE, but also just simply utilizing down attack and back attack. Obviously in History, you don't get down attack, you don't get air attack. You want to gain as many back attacks as possible, which means CCing, and which means chaining your CCs together. And those CCs allow you to gain those back attacks. It gives you the time to get behind the mobs and to get the back attack. Obviously, Ranger doesn't benefit from back attacks, so I'm not going to demonstrate that. I'm going to focus more on air and down attack. But the same concepts apply for History for other classes. So, air attack. I think most people understand what an air attack is. Air attack is triggered on some skills. When a mob is knocked down or floated, they enter an air state where they can be air attacked. And air attack is a very powerful modifier. The exact numbers have been changed a couple of times, but it is more powerful than crit. And usually it's on a scale that can crit as well. So especially at Mantrams or Akhman, where the mobs are pretty tanky, and landing that air attack could mean completely chunking mobs. So you want to utilize skills that can be chained together to benefit from that. Okay, so this brings us to the last talking point of the video. So you've done all of this, you've looked at all of this, you're still finding yourself not quite as efficient as you'd like to be. What can you do to improve? Or what are other areas that you can look at? And you're comparing what you're pulling somewhere to somebody else. Same class or not. Loot buffs are very important. Common Blessing, especially with spots like Mantrums that don't have 100% trash drop rate, or like the totem specifically, can dramatically increase your trash per hour. If you get a number from somebody and it's significantly higher than what you're pulling, all right, maybe look at loot buffs, look at your ecology rate, look at Common Blessing. Those can be huge factors in trash per hour. If you're not running either of those, or if you have low ecology, that can really hurt your numbers. Another thing, specifically at Manchums, Ronaros, and Akhman, if you're moving very quickly after you clear a pack and you're consistently hitting the 10 target limit or near the 10 target limit, your pets will not be able to pick up the loot as soon as the mobs die. So pausing before you leave to another pack, or walking away from another pack before you start using movement skills, can give your pets enough time to pick that stuff up, and that can increase your numbers. The last thing to potentially look at is crystal setups. You can gain a significant amount of AP from crystals. You can gain ignore resist, which is potentially beneficial depending on where you're grinding. You can gain accuracy, that may be beneficial depending on where you're grinding as well. So look at those stat numbers, try some things out, test. The other thing to keep in mind is skill points are very valuable. There are certain flows, there are certain combos, there are certain what are considered luxury skills that can be very efficient, that can drastically increase your efficiency. So potentially look at those few things as areas that you can maybe make adjustments in or improves in. And lastly, record yourself, watch what you're doing, see the mistakes that you're making, and try to evaluate how you can improve those things. I hope this video didn't bore anybody too much. I tried to keep topics generic enough that it covered all classes and situations. And hopefully these techniques help people, these concepts help people in stepping into high-end grinding and improving on what they're already doing. It's by no means conclusive way to grind these spots or the absolute de facto best way to do any of this. But I feel it's a very good starting point for most people to try to work on these things. If you're curious about a guide for a specific grind spot, I am personally working on a Mantrums guide. There are other content creators that have guides for Akhman, like Jackie Felix and Histria, that are good resources to check out, that go more in depth on specifics at an individual grind spot, covering rotations and a few other things. I encourage you to check those out if you have more questions.